It looks like winter is finally beginning to stretch its icy fingers across the panhandle here in Florida. The days are getting short, the weather's getting cold, and I thought, might be time to go ahead and light the fireplace and get a little warmth back in the house. I also thought maybe it might be time to talk about some traveling, maybe talk about some locales where you might find some warm places, maybe some cold places, maybe some strange places. So, welcome to today's Cozy Horror with me, Dr. Plague, and a roaring fire and some wonderful tales for you. Sometimes it's nice to get as far away as you can, somewhere tropical, somewhere with sand and sun and fun. But when your exciting locale turns out to be a prison, it's hard to get away.
Liz couldn't really say she didn't know why she was here, but she could question why. Why a wise and just God would leave her here was beyond her, and if this was his plan, she wasn't sure of his wisdom. She could see him standing in the shadow of the palm trees, eyes red like a dog caught in the flash of a camera. All it did was stare, but she felt as if it wasn't all it intended to do. The trip had been one they'd planned for years, a girls' trip to the Bahamas, just her and her old sorority sisters, on a cruise for 5 sun-soaked days. Liz had been looking forward to it. It'd be nice to get out of the house for a while. Her BA in administration had mostly made a great dust catcher in the last 8 years since her graduation. Between the kids, the house, and her husband, and her call center job that she did to bring in a little spending money, she had little time for anything else. Well, that wasn't entirely true. Liz had contented herself with talking with her old sorority sisters, Janet, Claudia, and Maria, about their lives and what they'd all been up to. Janet wrote for a food blog, she and her husband jet-setting around as he ran his export business, and Liz loved to hear about all the foreign places she found herself in. Claudia was a lawyer, always the brains of the bunch, and Liz often celebrated with her over the computer about her courtroom victories. Maria was a designer in New York, and Liz would be lying if she didn't admit that she grudgingly lived vicariously through her bestie. Maria lived like one of the girls on Sex and the City, with a constant diet of different men, different gigs, and different problems that seemed to fix themselves before they got out of hand. Liz's life, in contrast, was pretty mundane. Her friends gushed appreciatively over the pictures of her kids, none of them having any, but it was clear that their admiration was mostly lip service. They were out living spectacular lives, while Liz was stuck in the gilded cage with her eggs. She was comfortable. Harold was a good man who took care of the bills and gave her whatever she wanted. She loved her kids dearly, but watching her friends as they went about their lives made her feel like hers was going nowhere. As she sat beside the fire, alone and watching the red-eyed creature, she now wished that she had stayed in her comfortable rut. When she had told Harold about the trip, his only real concern had been who would watch the kids. Harold was a dutiful husband, but he reminded her of an old song her mother had liked. She couldn't remember the name, but her mother had played it on cassette as she cleaned the house. Harold reminded her of a line from the song, one her mother always sang in tones of deepest disgust, a line that embodied Harold as much as it embodied her own father. "I'll raise the children while you go have a beer. Where is my John Wayne? Where is his shining gun? Where's my lonely ranger? Where have all the cowboys gone?" It was a good line. It had encompassed her life so well. Harold was not the owner of an export business. He wasn't a model or a defense attorney who might be moved to sleep with her after a trial. Harold was an assistant manager in a company that made oil drilling equipment. He was nice enough. He was stable. But his interest in her had clearly waned. It had happened sometime after their second child. She saw his eyes began to wander, and if he wasn't already having an affair, that his impending midlife crisis would surely drive him into one. She had assured him that her sister would watch the kids while he was at work, but that he might have to miss his after-work bar trips this week. I'm sure she'll watch them on Saturday, though, so you can meet your associates at the links for your golf game. In retrospect, she thought he might have been a little too glad to hear how her sister, 19 and home from college, would be coming to sit with the kids. But that might just be in her head. The news that he could still golf on the weekends had softened his mood a bit. He even slipped her a few extra hundreds so she could fly to Orlando instead of driving. The idea that she might be stuck in traffic and miss her cruise was comforting now. But as she thought about the reunion with her friends, it brought a smile to her cracked lips. They had all met at the airport. First Liz and Maria, with Janet and Claudia flying in an hour later. The four had gone to dinner, drinking and talking about what they'd been doing, and finally boarded the boat at nightfall. They'd had a grand send-off with fireworks and champagne, and the four of them had talked excitedly about what they would do once they arrived in the Bahamas. "Hope your husbands gave you a day pass, ladies," Maria joked with Janet and Liz, "'cause you never know who you might meet on this trip." As Liz stared at the man-shaped thing, its unblinking eyes focused on her like twin beams. She wasn't sure that this was the someone that Maria had meant. It had all been smooth sailing until the second night. The four of them had drank at the bar, dined in the main hall, watched a few of the floor shows, and gone to bed thoroughly pleased. Maria had come in a little later, after leaving with a fella from the bar, and Liz wondered if she might pick up a fling of her own. She had turned red at the thought. Did she dare do such a thing? She didn't think she could, but who knew what a trip might bring? The second day had been spent around the pool. Liz was a little more self-conscious than the other three. She'd never quite gotten her figure back after her second child, but that didn't stop the eyes from finding her. They soaked up the sun, pretending to ignore the ogling eyes of those who looked, and Liz felt desired in a way that she hadn't since college. Harold did his duty at least once a week, but she'd come to suspect that that was out of habit. The men who looked at her and her friends seemed willing to do far more than their duty, and the thought made her smile as she watched them from behind her sunglasses. They had dressed in their best that night, their reservations at the captain's table being semi-formal, and Liz thought she might find herself in someone else's bed besides her own later. She was feeling confident in a way that she hadn't since she had met Harold, and as they laughed over drinks and appetizers, she wished the night would never end. When the ship stopped suddenly, groaning as if it had hit something, and lurching like a wild animal, she hoped she was asleep in her bunk still, her afternoon nap still ongoing. Now she knew better. As she felt her eyes getting heavy, and heard the strange singing that had marked every evening after the first, she knew that the nightmare never ended. They started to evacuate soon after the sudden stop. The ship had run up against something, and it had shredded the side. Liz and her friends were shoved into a lifeboat with about a dozen others. They bobbed out into the night as the boat rode low in the water, its guts filling with the balmy island sea. Liz reflected that at least there had been enough boats for everyone, as the crewmen rowed them towards a collection of islands nearby. As Liz sat beside her friends, the adrenaline starting to ebb and the ocean rocking her amidst the warm bodies, she felt herself starting to drift off. You'd have said that such a thing was impossible, but she could hear others yawning and one particularly loud snorer behind her. She leaned her head against Maria and felt the other woman breathing heavily. It appeared Liz wasn't the only one getting tired, and as she drifted off, she thought she heard the first snatches of a song that would become very familiar. When she woke up, she found herself alone, the boat beached as the surf pushed it in and out amongst the sand of some unknown island. Liz had no idea how long she had been there, but the fact that she was alone filled her with a palpable dread. Where had everyone gone? Was she the only one left out of the 20 or so people in the boat? She got up, but immediately sat down as her sleeping legs refused to hold her. She tried to rub some of the feeling back into them, her hands as numb as her legs, and that was when she noticed the thing around her finger. It was a ring, woven from coconut fibers, and she couldn't remember seeing anything like it before. Where had it come from, and who had put it on her? It was tight on her finger, but Liz couldn't call it uncomfortable. It sat flush against her skin, and as she lifted it up to take a better look, she saw the creature for the first time. The island swam with fog, the trees and sand leading her to believe that it must be tropical. She had seen him in the mist, leaning against a palm tree as he stared at her. The two locked eyes, and she felt her skin crawl as he stared silently. It was as if they were the only two in existence, and the longer it went on, the less human he began to look. His arms became less human as they thickened and waxed and waned. Its legs appeared to double, then triple, and its head bulged oddly before returning to its normal dimensions. It was man-shaped, but certainly no man. They stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, but when it turned its head suddenly, the spell was broken. She heard Maria calling her through the fog, and when she turned back to look, it was gone. "Glad you're finally awake," Maria said. "We got a little worried when you wouldn't wake up." How long was I out for?" Liz asked, getting shakily to her feet as the pins began to recede. "Nearly a whole day. We left 3 others out here with you. Did all you wake up at the same time?" Liz shook her head as Maria took her arm and led her up the beach through the fog. "We've been trying to make something that will get the attention of ships or planes, but the fog is so thick I'm not sure anyone will see us. The rest of us have been trying to get some shelters up, but it's hard to find materials and all this." As they came through the fog, Liz could see that there were around 15 others milling about. Men, women, even a couple of kids went about their tasks without much enthusiasm. They looked at Liz disinterestedly as she and Maria approached, and Liz saw Janet and Claudia as they turned rocks into words so a plane might see them. They both waved as they walked over to them. The rest of the day was spent raising lean-tos and setting up fire pits. She met some of the others, her fellow castaways, and they seemed to have quite a mixed bag. There was Ben and his sister Catherine, Angela and her daughter Celeste, Margot, Roger, his boyfriend Francis, Tracy, who carried around a typewriter case with a manuscript inside, Gail, Kathy, and her son, Gregory. They feasted on nuts and fruit, coconuts, and some little crabs that Ben and Francis had managed to scare up around dusk, and as they ate, the group discussed what they would do tomorrow. "It might be nice to take stock of the island," Ben said. "Find out if there are any others here." "A source of fresh water might be good, too," Maria put in, and Liz couldn't help but notice that she kept looking shyly at the older man as he agreed. Liz tried to keep up, but it was hard to focus on planning. It was hard to focus on anything with the pair of red eyes that stared at her from the nearby palm tree. No one else seemed to have noticed it, and the longer it stared, the more she realized that it was staring only at her. Whatever the creature was, it seemed to have eyes only for Liz, though the attention was far from flattering. Her finger itched, and Liz realized that it was the first time she had thought about the ring in a while. She wondered if it had been given to her while she slept. Why not just take her too, if it had gotten that close? As the others began to get comfortable, Liz watched the creature in the fog as it stood its lonely vigil, which was why she was still awake when the singing began. Liz didn't know where it came from or whether it had anything to do with the mysterious voyeur, but she blinked a little too long and found the red eyes had gone when she was awake. She sat blinking, the sounds of snoring vibrating around her. The night was suddenly split by a heavy baritone. It rolled across the sleeping people, hitting Liz like the warm steam off a cup of tea. As she watched, a few of her fellow survivors staggered up, getting to their feet and walking towards the jungle. They moved like sleepwalkers, their legs taking them shakily into the fog. In the dark, Liz wasn't certain who it had been, but in the morning, there were 2 less than there had been the day before. She hadn't slept that night, but as the sun came up and turned the fog into a blanket of diamonds, she pretended to. The last thing she wanted was to answer questions about missing people. No one seemed to notice at first, but by noon the disappearance of 2 people was hard to ignore. "Any idea where Roger and Francis are?" Catherine asked, looking around like she might have just missed them. "Off doing God knows what, I'm sure," Ben muttered, drawing some dark looks from a few of the others. He had made his displeasure at the pair of them pretty clear to everyone but them, and didn't seem to care about their disappearance too much. A couple of people talked about going to look for them, but it was finally decided that if they had gone off on their own, then they would either come back or they wouldn't. People went about their day, some looking for food, others trying to find planes or boats to hail. As the day spun out, Liz wondered if she should tell someone what she had seen the night before. She hadn't told anyone about the man-shaped thing in the jungle, and if it was the same thing taking people, maybe they needed to know. Her thoughts chased her throughout the day, but as the sun set and the fire cast sparks into the night sky, Liz found herself awake and searching for the creature. She hadn't had far to look. It had been there since dusk, just watching her as she sat by the fire. The fog was still a thick pea soup, and the image within it swelled and distorted as she kept an eye on it. Her head dipped and jittered as she tried to stay awake, but when the singing began tonight, it was like a sweet lullaby. She saw 3 shapes rise around her, the fire turning them into silhouettes against the sparks, and as they stumbled away from the dancing flame, she tried to call out to them, to raise some kind of an alarm. She was fading away as the deep, resonant voice drowned her amidst the crashing waves of the beach, however, and soon she found herself asleep. The camp awoke to find they were 10 now, and Liz discovered that one of the shades had been Claudia. Another had been Angela's daughter, and she was beside herself with grief. "Has anyone seen Celeste? She was right here next to me when I fell asleep last night." "We should go look for them," Maria suggested, looking pleadingly at Liz and Janet as she tried to move the others to go with her. Most didn't seem keen on going off into the mist to hunt for people who'd disappeared, especially if there was something out there taking them. Liz found it impossible not to be moved by Maria's words, though, and Janet seemed to feel the same. Claudia was their friend, and Celeste was just a child. The thought of them lost and scared in a strange place made Liz's heart ache, and the 3 assured Angela that they would try their best to find her daughter. She thanked them tearfully. The disappearance had left her in a state of grief so deep that she could do little but sit and rock as she cried. In the end, the 3 set out to search for those who had disappeared, and the others watched them leave, with not much expectation that they would see them again. The foliage smooshed wetly underfoot as they searched, the fog a constant blanket around them. The palms gave way to thin pines and wispy spruces that seemed to grow small, round nuts. The ground was far too wet to see much. Any footprints that might have existed were obliterated by the soupy ground, and as the 3 women searched the jungle, they found no trace of the missing people. Liz was no tracker, but in the movies there were always signs left behind when someone went missing in the woods. Fabric left on a tree, hair hanging from a branch, maybe a swatch of blood smeared across the bark. But there was none of that here. It was as if the island had swallowed them up, leaving nothing behind to mark their passage from life to death. The whole time, Liz felt like she was being followed. She glanced fitfully around as she looked for the man-shaped thing. She caught the odd glance of something, some vague shape amidst the mist, but it was impossible to tell if it was her voyeur or not. She felt pursued, this thing dogging her heels wherever she went, and she began to wonder if it was the thing that had summoned them to the island. Were they all just lunch for this creature? A game of cat and mouse to break up the monotony of its existence? When the sun began to set, they were forced to head back to camp empty-handed and heavy-hearted. Angela was inconsolable. The group came together for her, but their eyes were more often than not on the jungle. The fires were stoked, and as people began to get comfortable for sleep, Liz found herself too tired to join them. She had collapsed after they'd returned from the search, exhausted from all that walking, and her sleep had been heavy and dreamless. That night, Liz finally got to meet her mysterious watcher, and it likely saved them from another loss. It was late when she jerked awake, unsure how long she'd been asleep. The fire was burning low now, the ashes flickering into the sky as the logs crumbled beneath the assault of the heat. Liz thought at first that the waves had woken her up, but as she glanced into the gathering shadow, she could see those red eyes as they bore into her. They were closer now, maybe 15 feet away, but Liz was finding it harder and harder to be terrified of her mysterious watcher. The longer she sat looking at those red eyes, the more curious Liz found herself. "Hello?" she asked, keeping her voice low so as not to wake anyone up. The red eyes blinked, unsure, but when a voice answered her, it was very different from the deep baritone she'd heard singing at night. "Hello," it answered, its voice unsure as its features remained unknowable from behind the thick fog. Do you live here?" Liz asked, feeling foolish almost at once. It had been here since before they got here. Of course it lived here. "Yes, for most of my life, I think." The two talked for a bit, Liz becoming more comfortable the longer it didn't simply leap on her and gobble her up. It confirmed her suspicions that the island wasn't boundless and that her group of survivors were the only people here. She asked about the fog, and it told her that it just always was here, but that it kept everything nice and cool, so it wasn't unwelcome. It would have amazed her how quickly she fell into a normal conversation with this creature if she hadn't been so absolutely exhausted. As it stood, it seemed like the most natural thing to have happened in a while. "Are you the one singing at night?" she asked after it finished telling her about the caves near the edge of the island. It was beginning to lighten on the horizon, and Liz realized that it might leave before she got some of her burning questions answered. The eyes had been crinkling a little as it spoke, clearly enjoying their talk, but as she asked about the song, they took a different downturn. Was it mistrust, or was he ashamed of the answer? "Yes, that's me," he answered, clearly hesitant. Are you the one—" "Liz?" someone said sleepily, and Liz turned to see Maria sitting up groggily. Who are you talking to?" Liz turned back to introduce Maria to the thing she'd been so comfortably chatting with, but it was gone. "No one. Must have been talking in my sleep," Liz answered. There were no new missing people in the morning, but it did little to help the tension. Ben had started talking about making spears or something to defend themselves, but most of the others were more concerned with surviving. Even so, the foragers took homemade spears he had made when they went to look for food. His sister Catherine tried to talk to him, telling him that he was making everyone anxious, but he loudly told her that everyone should be worried about whatever was taking people in the night. Angela looked like a ghost as she sat looking at the waves, and people seemed content to give her space. She was mourning the loss of her daughter, and it was unclear whether her tears were swelling the ocean or the ocean was rushing forward to give her its salt. Liz found herself thinking about the odd creature as she went about her day. It hadn't been like she had expected, and she found herself wondering if it had really been the one taking people. She still hadn't told anyone about it, and most of the others would have assumed that she was going crazy. The thought of those red eyes creeping up to talk to her in the night would have scared some of them and made others think that she was losing it. Worse yet, she suspected that Ben would stay up and try to fight it if she told him, so she kept her mysterious new friend to herself. For the next week, she would stay up after the fire burned low and meet with it. She didn't hear the singing on those nights, and the red eyes seemed more than happy to come back night after night so they could learn more about her. Whatever it was, it seemed very interested in Liz and the life she had lived on the mainland. They talked about boats and cars and television, the food she used to eat, the people she'd known, her family, anything else the creature could think of. Liz would find herself watching him as his body did strange things, thickening and shriveling, multiplying and dividing, and the longer she watched it, the less afraid she became. The longer they talked, the less substantial it seemed to become, and that worried her. Liz found that she was afraid of losing it, the thing that made her feel almost normal. The mist seemed to clutch at it, making its features even less recognizable, and it added a level of unreality to it. It made it seem as if it were fading away. "Can I tell you a secret?" it said suddenly, leaning in close one night and causing Liz to blink as the fog pattered against her face. Sure, she said, glad for a break in conversation. Liz had been worried that she might run out of things to talk about, and then it would go away. She'd forgotten to be afraid of it, and was glad for the company and the attention this thing showed her after everyone else had gone to sleep. She missed her family and her children most of all, but having it here to talk to made it a little easier, a little more tolerable. When you first noticed me, I had come to watch you. Me? Liz asked, surprised. Why me? I noticed you when your boat came. You were just sitting there, sleeping, and I couldn't take my eyes off you. That's why I gave you the ring. Liz had been struggling with the conflicting nature of being both uncomfortable at the idea of this thing watching her and strangely flattered by its attention. When was the last time anyone had paid that sort of attention to her? Certainly not at home. Certainly not since she left college and started her descent into wedded bliss. She jumped a little when he mentioned the ring, having almost forgotten about it until right then. Sometimes she would go all day without thinking about it, and then it would suddenly catch on something, or the scratchy fibers would peel at her skin like steel wool, and she would remember that it was there. You gave me the ring? She asked, watching its head wobble oddly. I did, and though it sounded like it wanted to say more, it was unsure how to proceed. I don't know what to say, Liz said, knowing exactly what she wanted to say, but unsure if she could ask. The two sat in silence for a few minutes, just listening to the waves break on the beach as they stared at each other. Why don't you ever sing anymore? Liz asked suddenly, causing the eyes to back up a little bit. They backed further away, getting closer to the tree line, but still unable to look away from Liz. Why don't you sing anymore? She asked again, and this time it sounded like an accusation. He was almost 30 feet away, but Liz still heard him when he whispered the secret he longed to keep hidden. Because I don't want to hurt you, but I'm so hungry. As the sun came up, dispelling some of the fog, Liz was left with nothing but her confusion of mismatched feelings. Whatever he was, he managed to hold out for another 3 days. Liz didn't see him again until the third night, and that was when she heard the singing. Liz had thrown herself into any task she could find, trying to take her mind off of him. She wasn't exactly sure when he had gone from it to a him, but the transition made her wary. She'd been working to leave the island, wanting to return to the life she'd known, but now her tasks seemed so pointless. Maria had started lighting fires along the coast in an attempt to get the attention of a passing ship. Janet wanted to make a map of the island, something they could use to explore deeper for supplies. Ben wanted to find better shelter in case the weather changed. Gail wanted to try to find out if they could see the shipwreck at some point on the island, so they could get their bearings. Tracy just wanted to sit and work on her manuscript, and the others seemed content to just exist here until it was all over. It all seemed very trivial to Liz. Despite this, she threw herself into anything that came her way, whether it was scouring the island for resources, looking for somewhere to move the group, or just feeding fuel to the multiple signal fires. All the while, she could feel the eyes of her admirer as they followed her. She never saw him lurking in the mist, but she could sense his presence. He kept his distance, watching her from afar, and Liz was worried that she had offended him. She had suspected that he was the one luring people away, but she hadn't really understood the implication until he'd spelled them out for her. They would never find their fellow survivors, no matter how much they searched, and it was strange to feel so attached to someone who saw you as food. Angela had disappeared on the second day, but Liz doubted that her new friend had anything to do with it. Angela had done little else but weep for 2 days, the sea drinking her tears greedily. She wouldn't eat or drink, wouldn't come to camp no matter what the time, and when they woke up to find her stretch of beach had gone empty, Liz assumed that she had just wandered out into the sea. It might have been the kindest thing for her, but Ben had other ideas. With only 9 of them, Ben and Gail were now carrying clubs and accompanied anyone who left the camp to forage. They had appointed themselves as de facto guardians of the camp, and Ben seemed to have decided that he was their leader. He and Catherine argued often, but his patience for her seemed to be running thin. Kathy and Gregory had taken to sleeping close to Liz and her friends, and Kathy kept a protective arm around her son at all times. Tracy slept with her arms around her typewriter case, holding it like someone might a stuffed animal, but even she had moved closer to the group for protection. When Catherine came to join them on the third night, they all slept in a shallow pile, like rabbits in a warren. Ben and Gale sat around the fire, blinking owlishly as they kept watch. But to Liz, it began to feel more like a prison camp than a group of survivors. Liz woke up on the third night to the sound of singing. She found herself looking for those piercing red eyes amongst the fog, and found his shadowy body not too far away. Dark forms imposed themselves across her vision, and she watched them lumber into the trees before realizing what had actually woken her. It was only Ben by the fire now, Gale having left to go with her mysterious admirer, but now only Tracy's battered typewriter case was left to mark that she had existed at all. Some of the others were beginning to squirm, but instead of lingering, the music began to fade almost at once, making a couple of them jerk quietly as they sat down. One of them had been Janet, all three of the women sleeping close enough to each other for some semblance of protection, and as Liz settled back in, she found herself feeling torn about the absence of her mysterious new friend. Ben was upset the next day, enraged by the loss of Gale, and the others stuck close to camp that day. A light rain had blown in, and they seemed content to fix the boat tarp they had taken off the lifeboat to keep the worst of the rain off the fire. They huddled underneath it, shivering as the storm pattered around them. Ben stayed up late, his sleep utterly forgotten, but Liz's visitor didn't come back that night. She supposed he was full after eating so well the night before, but Liz still found her own sleep difficult. She was exhausted, unsure how much longer she could do this, and as she drifted off, she wondered who would be missing in the morning. When Janet's hand slid out of hers, Liz sat up in time to watch her walk out into the rain. The singing was getting farther away already, and when she looked at Ben, she found that he was snoring in the sand after tumbling off the log he'd been sitting on. Liz went after her friend before she could think better of it, and the rain was cold on her face as she moved out into the darkness. It didn't seem to affect Janet at all, and as Liz pulled at her to get her attention, it was like pulling on a stone. She strained at her, looping her legs around her as she tried to trip her up, but Janet's eyes were set as she made her way into the woods. Janet pulled her into the jungle, the two still struggling, and Liz could see those red eyes burning into the depths of her from the woods. "Stop it!" she yelled, tears mingling with the rain and sliding down her face. "Don't take her! She's my friend!" There was silence in the jungle, broken only by the falling of the rain as it hit the thick fronds of the trees. It was almost too loud for her to hear when he spoke, but it was just loud enough to reach her as he slipped into the wet blackness of the surrounding jungle. "Sorry, it's my nature," said the scorpion to the frog. She was left to ponder that as the rain soaked her to the bone, leaving her confused and apprehensive. Maria wrapped Liz in a hug when she came back, the camp awake and holding torches. They had spears too, even Gregory, and Ben pressed one into Liz's hand as Maria let her go. His eyes mistrusted her, but were resolved. He was clearly suspicious of her, but with only 6 of them remaining, he was forced to put his misgivings aside. "We're going after it," he said. And as her eyes grew wide, Ben smiled knowingly. "That's right. I've seen it too. I saw it tonight as you tried to drag your friend back, and I've seen it lurking around the camp more than once. I'm still not sure it's the thing that's taken people, but at this point, I don't much care. We're gonna find it. We're gonna kill it before it kills us." Liz wanted to deny him, wanted to scream at him, wanted to stab the spear into him and make him shut up, but instead, she fell in with Maria and let him lead her into the semi-darkness. She felt claustrophobic as they made their way into the jungle. Ben had no clue where he was going, but as the sun rose over the horizon, he kept them moving as their torches burned low and their clothes clung to them. They had set out with bellies full of fire, determined to find this thing. They crisscrossed the island, the sun dispelling the shadows as they moved, but they never seemed to find anything that would make a good hiding spot for anything bigger than a bird or a badger. The longer they searched, the more frantic Ben seemed to become. "Where are you?" he kept whispering, looking around frantically as he stalked the groves. "It has to be here somewhere." His need to find the creature seemed insatiable, but by noon, Ben was forced to admit that he had no idea what he was doing. The group was tired and hungry, their legs hurting and the fire in them now quenched by the mist as they turned back towards the campsite. Ben seemed completely demoralized. Catherine finally put a hand on his shoulder, reminding him that they were exhausted and needed to eat, and he was finally forced to turn around and head back to camp. They had covered the whole island, beach to beach, and found no sign of Janet or anyone else. As they trudged back, Ben wasn't the only one looking downtrodden. They all knew that come morning, they would likely be 5 instead of 6. Liz sat by the fire now, remembering the last few days with sobering clarity. Ben had been taken next. He had tried to stay up and keep watch, wanting to catch this thing so he could keep them safe from it. But in the end, he had succumbed and fallen asleep. They had all been so tired after trudging through the jungle, but when they woke up, he was already gone. Kathy was next, and Gregory's cries had brought the rest of them around the next morning. By then, the 4 of them had been frantic. No one wanted to be next, but it seemed inevitable. They were all tired, their meals growing smaller as their numbers dwindled, and they were utterly trapped by the island they now found themselves on. They couldn't fight him. They couldn't escape him. They were nothing but cattle, just waiting for the slaughter. Catherine went next, but by then, Liz already thought she knew what she had to do. When he returned the following night, she was waiting for him. He seemed confused when he found her awake, Maria and Gregory snoring around her, and when she put a finger to her lips, his nod made her stomach churn. "What will you do when they're all gone?" she asked, watching the fire dance between them as the mist made it hiss. He didn't answer her, his red eyes boring into her as he hunkered and watched. "You seem to be saving me for last. Do you hate me so much that you'd make me watch the people I care about disappear before it's my turn?" "Never," he blurted, and she shushed him as Gregory stirred. "I would never torture you like that. It's only that I can't bring myself to hurt you. I need to eat to survive, but I hate that it must come at the expense of you." They pondered this for a moment, the fire hissing and spitting like an angry cat. "What if I went with you now? Would you let these 2 go and take me?" He was silent, but his nod was all the answer she needed. "Lift the mist and let them go, and I'll go with you." He seemed startled. I can't promise your safety. It's hard for me to control my hunger, as you've seen. I'm not sure I could forgive myself if I hurt you. I'm sure you'll have no trouble calling more boats here, just like you did to ours, right?" The eyes looked away sheepishly, but he didn't bother to deny it. "How did you know?" "I guessed. Just like I guessed that this ring might be stopping your song from calling me away at night. Right?" He nodded again. "It won't protect you, though, if I decided to just gobble you up one day when I got hungry." "It's a chance I'll have to take," she said, getting up and walking towards him. The red eyes widened, but as she walked into the mist that surrounded him, the cold membrane encompassed her and accepted her. Liz felt conflicted as she watched the boat leave with Maria and Gregory. The sound of the deep whistle had brought the 2 around as the sun rode high in the morning, and Maria had called her name for quite a while before leaving with the boy. The ship had seen the messages on the beach, seen the smoke from their fires, and Liz had been afraid that Maria wouldn't go for a minute. As the boat grew smaller and smaller on the horizon, a part of Liz wished she was on it. Another part had already accepted that this was her new home, as certain as she was that she belonged with the man whose strange hand now clutched at hers. As strange as it sounded, this had been the trip she wanted. Her old life seemed so dull now, Harold and her children had already started to fade as she stood beside this strange creature. As she turned to look at him, she wondered if she would become like him one day. Maybe he had been like her once, before being discovered by something like him. Maybe he had left a life like hers behind, sacrificing everything because it felt right. Regardless, this was her home now, and as she turned to look at him, she felt complete in a way that she had never felt before.
Fire's really getting warm. I can feel it from over here. It's nice to sit here with all of you and feel that warmth just wash over me. Moving is never easy. Neither are funerals, and I suppose this story has both. Sometimes when a family member dies, they leave us something. An object, or a memory, or a strange new home where we might find other strangeness just down the hill. So, in this story, let's bring in the new flesh and wish it a long and happy life.
The town of Ingleswood was in the middle of nowhere, according to the map. I'd never heard of it before. Neither had any of my friends when I asked them before leaving. Even more strange was receiving a correspondence from a relation I hadn't spoken to since I was a young child. It had come out of nowhere, a letter proclaiming my great-uncle to be dead, and informing me that I had inherited a slaughterhouse in a town I had never heard of. A slaughterhouse, of all things. I might have thought it was a prank, had there not been a rusted metal key included in the letter. Somehow, part of me knew the key was real, and that it belonged to the slaughterhouse my great-uncle had once owned. The ownership had been passed on to me, for reasons as of yet unknown, and I would have to drive up there in order to settle the inheritance. Which is why I was currently driving down a long serpentine road through a dense cluster of trees. It was still early afternoon, but the sky was gray and heavy, casting a dismal pall over the forest. Shadows crept out of the trees and onto the road, making it difficult to see without my headlights. I shuffled forward in my seat, hands gripping the wheel tighter as the trees grew around me. I'd been driving for just over 3 hours now, and it had been at least 30 minutes since I'd seen another car. According to my map, I should almost be there, yet I hadn't seen any signs of civilization. Nothing but empty fields and abandoned, ramshackle buildings in the middle of nowhere. And now, this forest that seemed endless and labyrinthine. The tires hit something in the road and the car jerked, throwing me forward in my seat. I slammed my foot on the brake and the car skidded to a halt, gravel hissing underneath my tires. I glanced in the rearview mirror and spied a shadow in the road, and I couldn't tell what it was. Had I hit an animal or something? I hadn't even seen anything. I debated ignoring it and driving off, but in the end, I cut the engine and climbed out of the car. The air beneath the trees was cold, and goosebumps prickled the back of my neck as I walked over to the misshapen lump in the road. The smell hit me first. The smell of old rotten blood. It was an animal carcass, a rabbit maybe, or something. It was too mangled and bloodied for me to tell. Flies buzzed around the torn flesh, the gray glint of bone poking from beneath the fur. Whatever it was, it had been dead for a while. I stood up and shook my head, lip curling against the stench. I'd move it off the road, but I didn't have anything with me that would do the trick, and I'd rather not touch it without proper protection. I would just have to leave it. Maybe carrion birds would come and pick it up later. I returned to my car, feeling a little bit nauseated, and drove off, watching the dead animal disappear behind me. 15 minutes later, and I finally broke free of the forest. Muted gray sunlight parted the clouds, dappling my windshield. On the other side of the trees were more fields, still noticeably empty. Found it odd that there were no cattle around, no sheep or pigs either. What was the use of a slaughterhouse if there was nothing to slaughter?
In the distance, I glimpsed a small cluster of buildings. It was more like a settlement than a town. Stone and brick and straw. Not the kind of place I expected to find myself inheriting a building. Had my great-uncle really lived out in the middle of nowhere? Was that why I'd never heard of him? The road turned loose and rutted, and the car jerked and bumped as I drove closer to the town. A small sign, weathered and covered in mud, read, "Welcome to Ingleswood." At least it had a sign. The place wasn't a made-up town after all, I guessed. I pulled the car to a stop at the side of the road and pulled out my map again. The letter had contained specific coordinates to the slaughterhouse, which, according to the map, was a little distance away from the town itself, on the very border. If I followed the road for a couple more miles and then took a left, I would arrive at the house. A flutter of nervous energy tightened my stomach. Didn't really know what to expect when I got there, and what I was going to do about the situation. The only reason I'd driven down here was to get a better understanding of things, assess the area, try to figure out what to do. Should I just sell the slaughterhouse, or should I move here? The latter option didn't sound particularly appealing after getting a glimpse of the area, but wouldn't know until I had a proper look around, I guess. I followed the loose gravel road for a little while longer before spotting a turnoff to the left. The remains of a broken stone wall lined the path, and I spotted another sign that was too rusted to read. Signaled to turn, even though there was no other car in the area. I followed the path through the sheltered wooden area until I reached a small house. It was more of a cottage, really, with white brick and a thatched roof. The place had an air of dilapidation about it, as though nobody had lived here for quite some time. Considering my great-uncle had passed recently, I knew that wasn't true. Beside the house was a large freestanding shed. A rusted padlock was chained around the door, and I knew without a doubt that the key I'd been given was the key to the shed. Did that mean the shed was the slaughterhouse? I parked the car on the grass and climbed out. The air out here was fresh and pleasant, a nice change from the city. Though beneath the fragrance of nature, I could smell something else. Something darker, richer. Old blood and rust, and butchered meat. I threw a brief glance at my surroundings. My gaze skimmed past the trees and the field and the faint curl of smoke blotting the distant sky. I couldn't hear anything beyond the wind. No bird song, no chittering bugs. Couldn't hear cars or people or anything that would suggest there was a town nearby. I let out a sigh. Maybe it would feel lonely living out here. I was used to the city, after all. I grabbed my rucksack from the truck and fished out the letter and the key I'd been given. No key to the house, which was odd. I'd phoned my great-uncle's executor before driving out here, but apparently all material belongings were still inside the house, and the shed key was the only thing that had been passed on to me directly. I walked up to the cottage door and tried the handle. Locked, unsurprisingly. If I couldn't figure out a way to get inside, I'd call the damn locksmith out here, which could take hours. Muttering in frustration, I began rooting around the rocks and broken plant pots sitting outside the cottage. Whatever plants had once resided there were now withered and shriveled, their roots black and gnarled as they poked through the soil. I turned one of the empty pots over and grinned when my eyes caught a glint of silver. I hadn't really gotten my hopes up, so finding the key immediately lifted my spirits. At least now I could get inside the house. Leaving the slaughterhouse locked for now, I headed inside the cottage. The air was stale and heavy with dust, and my eyes immediately started to water. How long had it been since anyone had opened that door? I wasn't familiar with the circumstances of my great-uncle's death, so I wasn't sure if he'd spent his last moments in the house or not. That thought made me shudder, as my nose picked up the smell of damp and mold. Apart from some minimal furnishings, the house was mostly bare. I didn't know what kind of man my great-uncle had been, but apparently he didn't like clutter, and very rarely dusted.
I ran a finger over the sideboard in the hallway and grimaced as a thick layer of dust clung to my skin. If I did decide to stay here, I was going to take a lot of work to get this place up to standard. The longer I stayed here, the more I wanted to leave without looking around. But I couldn't ignore it forever. At some point, I had to assess the state of the slaughterhouse and make a decision about what to do. I went through each room, casting a cursory look over the furniture and testing the electricity and the water supply. Everything seemed to be running, which was a bonus. I'd already planned to stay the night here, so having hot water and lights would make it a lot easier. Upstairs, I paused on the landing and peered out the window. At the back of the house was a field of brown, uncut grass and some stilted shrubs. I could see the edges of the shed beside the cottage, the old wood stained and weathered. In the distance, I could see the cluster of houses that formed the village. As I was about to turn away, I glimpsed movement at the edge of the property, amongst the tree line. Someone stood between the trees, watching me. I couldn't get a good view of their face, but in the brief glance, it seemed gray and hollow, like wax. The figure darted away through the trees and disappeared. I frowned, the unease from earlier returning. Was it a villager? Shaking it off, I searched the upstairs room. Large master bedroom and bathroom, a linen cupboard, a smaller guest bedroom, and that was all that was here. Like downstairs, everything up here was old and run down and covered in a thick layer of dust and mildew. I closed the bedroom door behind me and went back down into the kitchen, where I'd left my rucksack. The rusty key to the slaughterhouse sat on the table, just where I'd left it. Figured it was about time to see what I was dealing with next door. Grabbing the key, I left the house and went across to the shed. The metal of the padlock was ice cold against my fingertips as I inserted the key and twisted it. The lock fell away and the door edged open with a creak. Shadows spilling out across my feet. I peered into the darkness as I gripped the edge of the door and pulled it open further. The air inside smelled stale and old. The same undercurrent of old blood ran beneath the surface. Drawing in a deep breath, I pushed the rest of the way in and stepped inside, letting the dull afternoon light filter inside. The slaughterhouse was nothing like what I'd expected. Inside was nothing but an empty shed. The wood was damp and starting to rot, the ground full of old hay. There was no equipment that you'd expect in a slaughterhouse. No cold room to store meat. It was just an empty shed. Perhaps it wasn't a functioning slaughterhouse after all. Then why had it been called such in the inheritance? Something glinted in the sunlight, and I looked up. Several large metal hooks hung from the ceiling, the kind that you hung meat on. But what was the point when there was nowhere to prepare it? Unless I was missing something. This was a plain old shed with some leftover meat hooks still stuck to the ceiling. I raked a hand through my hair and sighed. Was it a waste coming all the way out here? I shook my head. Not a waste. I still had to figure out what to do with this place, now that it was legally mine. Leaving the slaughterhouse, I relocked it and pocketed the key before heading back into the house. It was getting on in the afternoon, and I was tired from driving all morning, so I decided to grab a bite to eat while considering my options. By the time evening had rolled around, I still hadn't made up my mind about the place. There wasn't much merit in staying here if the slaughterhouse couldn't actually be used, and I didn't particularly fancy being stuck in the middle of nowhere. I could sell it, but not as it was. It would take a bit of work to get it into decent shape and make it appealing to potential buyers. The final option was just leave it here to gather dust, but it seemed like a waste. I had debated heading to the village to see who lived there, but after spying the strange figure watching me from the trees, part of me had been reluctant to venture too far from the house. Maybe I'd walk down there in the morning. As dusk grew outside, shadows encroaching further into the cottage, and a chill crept into my bones, I turned on most of the lights and went around drawing the curtains to block out the night. I wasn't fond of sleeping in unfamiliar places, so I
spread my sleeping bag on the floor of the downstairs sitting room instead of upstairs. Using hot water from the kitchen, I made myself some instant noodles and ate them from the packet, listening to the radiator clank and groan as it rattled to life. Being on my own in a strange house was starting to make me feel a little unsettled, so I turned on the television to fill the silence. Nothing but static burst from the screen, so I switched it off just as quickly. With nothing else to do, I headed to bed early. I nestled into my sleeping bag and spread another blanket over me to ward off the chill. Fell asleep the second my head hit the pillow. I woke up early the next morning to the sound of someone tapping at the window. Blinking away the grogginess, I sat up. The room was still dark, shadows lingering around the edges. I reached over to switch on the lamp and stretched the crinks out of my neck from camping on the floor all night. What was making that noise? The curtains were still drawn, but I could see movement in the gap between the edges. Climbing stiffly to my feet, I walked over to the window and tentatively pulled the curtains aside, peering out. A beady black eye stared back. It was a crow. Ruffling its inky black feathers, it tapped its beak 3 more times against the glass before flying away. I watched it go, frowning. Dawn had yet to break, and the sky was still in the clutches of night. According to my watch, it wasn't even 5 a.m. yet. But I was awake now, so I dragged myself into the kitchen to get some instant coffee. I slept right through the night, but I remembered having strange dreams in the midst of it. Dreams about meat and fresh and bloodied meat hooks. No doubt because of the circumstances I'd found myself in. When I returned to the living room, I found the key to the slaughterhouse sitting on top of my rucksack. I thought I'd left it on the kitchen table, and seeing it elsewhere left me momentarily disconcerted. Had I moved it there? I must have. There was nobody else here but me. Maybe I'd slept less well than I thought. I didn't trust the pipes enough to have a hot shower, so I changed into a fresh pair of clothes and drank my coffee until the light grew outside. It was another damp gray day, and the forest was as silent as it had been last night. Wherever that crow had flown off to wasn't anywhere close by. Once it was light enough to see by, I grabbed the key to the shed and went outside to investigate. I didn't really expect it to look any different, but maybe having had a full night's rest would give me a different kind of insight into what to do with this place. I unlocked the door, letting the padlock and chain fall to the ground with a heavy thump, and pulled it open. Inside was dim, and it took me a second for my eyes to adjust. As soon as I glanced inside, I froze, my heart lurching in my throat. The slaughterhouse was no longer empty. Thick slabs of dark meat hung from the rusted hooks, the air thick with the smell of fresh blood. What the hell? Where had it come from? Last night, there had been nothing in here. The shed had been locked, and as far as I was aware, the only key to open it was in my possession. How had this meat gotten in here? Who was responsible? I took a step inside, feeling perturbed and perplexed by the discovery. There was just under a dozen chunks of flesh, as lean and expertly cut, glistening red in the morning light. I wasn't familiar with meat in this form, so I couldn't tell you which animal it belonged to, but I could tell it had been prepared recently. All of a sudden, I felt unnerved and unsafe. What was going on here? This was supposed to be my property, yet someone had clearly been creeping around here last night, hauling slabs of meat into my shed. I didn't like the thought of that at all. As I tried to sift through my thoughts, I heard approaching footsteps from behind. My heart pulsed faster as I turned around, not sure what to expect. A group of about 20 people were approaching my property from the trees. First thing I noticed was their gauntness. Like that mysterious figure I'd seen in the forest, their skin was pallid and their flesh sunken, their clothes hanging like rags off bony shoulders. They looked starved. "Meat," one of the strangers cried, their voices hoarse and brittle. "We have meat again." "We have meat again," someone echoed. "We are saved." "What?" I muttered, stumbling back in surprise as the group of people, presumably from the village, drew closer. "What's going on?" "You brought us meat. You saved us," the older villager in the front of the mob said, reaching out his hands in a thankful gesture. Before I could do or say anything, the villagers piled into the shed and began removing the meat from the hooks, slinging it over their shoulders with joyous cries. "Wait, what are you doing?" I blurted, aghast at their action. The man from before tottered up to me, his eyes sunken and his cheeks hollow. "Thank you. We're so happy the slaughterhouse has a new owner." He seemed about to turn away, so I quickly grabbed his arm, my fingers digging into his flesh. What is going on here? Where did this meat come from? A slow smile spread across the man's face, revealing pink, toothless gums. "You don't know? This place is cursed. See?" He pointed into the shed, and I followed his gaze. Fresh meat was starting to grow from the hook, materializing from air. The flesh grew and expanded until it was the same size as the others, and one of the villagers quickly removed it from the hook. I stared in bewildered silence, struggling to put the pieces together of what I was seeing. What was happening here? Where was the meat coming from? How could it just appear like this? "I still don't understand," I finally uttered in a hoarse whisper. Felt like I was in the middle of a dream or a nightmare. "The hooks give us flesh," the man said. "But where does it come from?" I said, shaking my head. "This flesh that never stops growing on these hooks is the flesh of the slaughterhouse's owner. It is your flesh," the man explained, his dark eyes glistening in the dimness. Behind me, meat continued to grow from the hooks, and the villagers continued to harvest it. My flesh?" I whispered, the words sticking in my throat. "What do you mean?" I looked down at myself. I was still intact. How could it be my flesh? "It's a reproduction of your flesh. This flesh never rots, never goes bad. It is as alive as you are." The man still wasn't making any sense. How could it be my flesh? How was any of this possible? These villagers, this place, were crazy. The longer I stayed, the more danger I would be in. I had to leave as soon as possible. As if reading my thoughts, the man placed a hand on my arm, a warning look in his eye. "There are conditions you must follow. However," he said, his voice a low rasp, "if you ever leave this town, your bond to this place will be broken, and the flesh will start to rot." My mouth went bone dry, the ground feeling unsteady beneath my feet. "You mean," he nodded, "when the meat begins to rot, so do you. Your body will decay and eventually perish, and we, the ones who rely on your flesh, will starve. You have no choice but to stay here for the rest of your life and feed us with the flesh from your body. This is your duty," he said, tightening his old crooked fingers around my arm. "There is no escape. You must accept your fate or wither away, just like the owner before you." The old house is really starting to warm up. Maybe chase away some of that chill from all those rainy days that came before it. Though, I do hope there are rainy days to come, since those are my favorites. Every town's got its weird stories, especially if you're an ambulance driver or a town sheriff or maybe just a concerned citizen. So, Let's hear from a member of local law enforcement as we study the tale of the Metal Man of Courtney, Arizona.
I'm a cop in Nevada, for a tiny town of less than 1,000. Courtney, Nevada doesn't actually have a police force. The mayor is usually whoever's soberest at election time, and it's made up of retirees and people trying not to be noticed. It lies between Austin and Eureka, and the whole town is managed by a single officer. Me. I live in Eureka, but 3 months out of the year, I stay in the dingy little Palmer Inn and operate the emergency phone system. It routes to my cell phone, and when I'm not out on a call, I can be found in my room, watching TV. The Palmer actually gets really good satellite TV. You probably think it sounds like a post from hell, but the crime rate in Courtney is next to nothing. I've been doing this on and off for about 3 years, and I think I've only had to reach for my gun twice in that time. We do 3 months on, and then swap with another officer for 3 months, but sometimes I'll just do 6 months in a row. Courtney is as peaceful as a town full of oldsters and whatever else can be. After tonight, however, I'm not sure I can look at the place the same way again. I'm trying to write up paperwork now, but I'm just not sure what to say. There's no way they'll believe the truth, but I swear it's what happened. I'm getting ahead of myself, though. I'm hoping that if I write it out here, then it might be easier to explain to my supervisor. I was sitting out on the town line with my radar gun at about 10:30 at night, when the quiet town suddenly got less quiet. So the only thing really to do in Courtney to justify me being there is to catch speeders on Highway 50. The speed zone changes from 65 to 35 in the course of a mile, and the number of drivers that seem to think they can just blow through the little town doing 60 is way too damn high. I had a rig of my own invention that held the speed gun up to the window, and as good a hiding place as I could behind an old billboard, leaving me basically unseen and my hands free to watch whatever on my phone. I had foregone the adventures of Luffy and the crew in favor of a new horror podcast, and I was getting comfy when something hit the ground hard enough to rock my cruiser in its frame. My phone fell into the floorboard about a second before the speed gun came down to hit me on the head, and I came out of my car rubbing my scalp and cussing like a sailor. I got out and looked across the street, seeing heat shimmers as something cooled in the desert nearby. The oldsters who lived here had told me that meteors were sometimes seen falling out into the desert, but this one had damn near taken my cover out. I had never seen a meteor up close, not unless you count the ones at the museum that my school had drugged the class to when I was a kid, and I was interested in getting a good look. It would be kinda cool to see something that had been cruising through space until a few minutes ago, and I made my way across the road and towards the crater. I was still in the road when, to my surprise, I heard the sound of metal grating against itself. I could see the top of something dark as it rose from the lip of the crater, and the top was still glowing from its entry through the atmosphere. The hole wasn't terribly deep, but this would have still been taller than me by a foot. Would have been a shame if one of those aforementioned speeders had come blowing through while not paying attention, 'cause I would have been roadkill. I was about 60 feet from it, but it looked like one of those NASA spacesuits, except made out of silver. When it moved, it was the herky-jerky kind of steps of a sci-fi robot. You know, the ones you might see in a 50s movie. It slipped in the sand a little, but managed to find its footing as it made its slow way out of the crater. If it noticed me, it gave no sign, and when it came to the top of the hole, it turned and started making its way for town. I hadn't noticed before it got on solid ground, probably because the sand was running down to quench it, but when it stepped, its footsteps left little fires behind. It made it easier to follow, and as I went back to the cruiser to get my radio, I realized I had no one to call right about the time I keyed up the mic. I was here by myself. I was the law in Courtney, and it was up to me to do something about this. I dropped the handset and climbed in instead, keying the engine as I pulled out and followed the strange creature that had crashed randomly on the outskirts of the little burg. It wasn't hard to follow him. His feet left little fires behind him, and his pace was slow, as if he weren't really in a hurry, as he made his way closer and closer to town. Watching him go, I wasn't really sure what to do with him if I tried to stop him. Could he be stopped with anything in my car? I had a shotgun, my sidearm, and a couple of those flashbangs we used on large groups of people. None of that seemed like it would do much against this metal man who was slowly making his way through the desert. Watching him move was like watching a stop-motion short. He was kind of a strange automaton, a metal man whose skin was still slightly red from his fall from space. Instead of pulsing and burning, as his steps had, he seemed to shimmer like a heat reflection. He didn't seem lost, his pilgrimage definitely going in a certain direction, and as the lights of the quick fill broke the darkness with their phosphorescent intrusion, I began to get a little nervous. The quick fill was a 24/7 gas station that boasted 12 gas pumps and a huge underground holding tank. God only knew what would happen if this thing set fires that went down to the reserve tank. I whipped into the parking lot as I popped the trunk and grabbed my shotgun. It had buckshot in it, a higher caliber than the 9mm slug in my Glock, and when I hefted it, it felt like I had 4 shells ready and waiting. There was a box of 12 in the trunk, and I put them in my jacket pocket before chambering around and taking the safety off. I didn't know what this thing was capable of, but I knew I couldn't let it menace my town. "You, all right, Sheriff?" Came a shaky voice from the door of the quick fill, and it startled me enough to almost make me drop my shotgun. Clyde Haggerty, the 19-year-old kid who ran the register at the quick fill after 10:30 p.m., looked pretty scared. He had probably watched me come screeching in, pop the trunk, and go digging for my shotgun, wondering what the hell was going on. In his mind, it was probably robbers or dopers, but he had no clue what was coming out of the desert for him. I didn't want him to see this thing suddenly vaporize me with a death ray or something, and when I turned towards him, he jumped back a little as the barrel of my shotgun flagged him. "Go get yourself somewhere safe, Clyde. Something's heading your way, and I don't want you to get mixed up with it." Clyde nodded, and I heard the door click as he went back inside. Hopefully, he was hiding in the cooler or something. I turned back to find the creature lumbering closer, its distance now about 50 feet from me. The shotgun wouldn't do much at that range, but that would give me enough time to follow protocol and give it a warning before opening fire. "Stop. I'm an officer of the Eureka Police Department, and I'm ordering you to halt and state your intent." The creature didn't even pause, just kept its course as it made for the gas station. "Stop. This is your final order to stop, or I will open fire." It was well within range now, the fires burning behind it, making it hard to miss, and when I squeezed the trigger, the gun bucked as the shot slammed into it. The metal man never slowed in his pursuit, and as I loaded another round, it was now about 20 feet from me. "Stop!" I yelled, squeezing the trigger and pumping a new shell into the barrel as the old one thundered forth. A third shot let fly a second later, but if the creature was even registering them, it never showed it. It kept coming as I fed new shells into the gun, and as I slid the fourth into the receiver, I felt a sudden and excruciating heat. It was like standing too close to a bonfire, and as I stumbled away from the thing, I looked up to find that it was within 10 feet of me. It appeared that it was still very hot, and its skin radiated an intense heat that the sand had done nothing to quench. I yelped again as my fingers blistered, and I realized the gun was soaking up as much heat as I was. I tossed it down, and not a moment too soon either. The bullets in the weapon began to erupt, sending the shotgun flying apart. As I turned away and covered my face just in time, I caught some shrapnel in the arm and a little in the back, but I was spared the worst of it. As it lumbered past, I tossed the shells out too, lobbing them as far as I could manage before they went off as well. Even so, I was reminded of a time as a kid when I'd reached for something underneath the radiator while it was still on. Even though I'd been careful not to touch it with my face or hands, I could still feel that heat coming off of it as I stretched for a toy that I had lost under there. It was like that now, except this thing was a walking radiator. It went right past me and towards the gas station, its course unerring. As it came around the side, I remembered another weapon at my disposal and ran back to the trunk of the cruiser. I had a fire extinguisher in there, one of the big ones that I'd needed to put out a trash fire once, and as the creature came around to the front of the store, I pulled the pin and sprayed it with a stream of foam. It coated the thing, hissing as it hit its superheated skin and sliding off like the cheese on those copper pans they're always showing on TV. It was impossible to tell if it was doing anything, but as I played it out, I heard a hellish sound coming from the front of the store. The thing had reached out and melted the glass on the double doors, walking through the hole as it went right into the quick fill. There wasn't much I could do but follow him. I didn't know where Clyde was, but I hoped that he was safe. The store looked empty as I followed at a relatively safe distance, and the front counter was vacant. It appeared that Clyde had taken me seriously, and as the creature stumbled into the little shop, I found myself spraying at fires left in its passing. He went by the chips, the candy, the snack cakes, all of them curling a little as the heat kissed them. He was making his slow way towards the drink cooler, and he seemed to be looking for something in particular. As he stood looking in, the floor bowed and sagged beneath his otherworldly warmth. I was worried that he would go right through the floor at this rate. When he reached out, slowly and deliberately, his hand melted its way into the cooler, and the puff of angry, cold air that came out was almost comical. It hissed against the creature's skin as it reached in for something, and when it came out with a bottle of Dr. Pepper, the container was already starting to warp. It tilted it towards its head, spilling the dark liquid all over itself, before reaching for another one. By the third bottle, they had stopped crumpling quite so quickly, and by the seventh, it was clear that it was tossing the liquid into whatever served as its mouth. It ran through the whole row of them before starting on the Diet Dr. Peppers, and as it finished the row too, I noticed its skin was less translucent than before. Some of the heat shimmer had left it, some of the blazing warmth had dissipated. It was cooling down, and as it dropped the mostly intact bottles to the ground, it released a very human sigh of relief. Then it fell to pieces on the floor of the quick fill, its body reduced to scrap. And that was the end of my encounter. I'm still not sure what to make of all this. The creature landed on Earth, tromped through the desert, destroyed my shotgun, wrecked up the quick fill, and then drank until he turned into scrap metal. Dr. Pepper, to be exact, but who's counting? I don't know if my supervisors will accept this or not, but I do have something they can use as proof, besides the crater on the outskirts of town. Every step that he took through the desert left behind a perfect little footprint of pure glass, and the glass has a tread in it. I've saved a few of them, just in case, and Clyde has provided a witness statement as well. Apparently he was hiding in the cooler when the creature came in, and saw it drink all the Dr. Pepper before collapsing. Hopefully, that'll be enough to convince my supervisors I'm not crazy. But I hope to never have another night like that one again. Something else comes to mind too, and it makes me hesitant to go to the fridge for my favorite midnight drink of choice. If my fire extinguisher did little more than kick up steam, what's in Dr. Pepper that quenched his heat so well?
Arizona sounds pretty good right about now. My father-in-law used to live in Arizona, and he said the heat was quite intense. He said the difference between Arizona heat and Florida heat was that the Arizona heat has the common decency to kill you, while the Florida heat just seems to linger, like a ghost that breathes hot air down your neck. He wasn't wrong, I'll tell you that. Speaking of, sounds like we're going from Arizona to the Nevada desert. specifically to Las Vegas. We all go to Las Vegas for different reasons. To gamble, to see the sights, to see the sights. But when the subject of today's story goes on a very special sightseeing tour, they may get a bit more than they bargained for. So, I hope you wore your walking shoes, 'cause today we're gonna walk with the dead men in the desert. It started as a weekend trip to Las Vegas. A 3-day weekend was coming up, so my friends wanted to add spice to their lives, and Vegas was on the bucket list. Not mine, theirs. I wanted to stay home and watch old cartoons I'd bought from the video store. Maybe just sleep in that Friday. Maybe I didn't make it clear to them, or maybe they just ignored me, but they had already bought me a plane ticket and booked a hotel room. With it being too late to refund anything, and out of financial obligation, I couldn't let that money go to waste and be a bad, boring friend. We landed and reached the hotel before noon. I had 5 friends with me, and everyone was feeling the excitement, especially one, Sadie. Sadie was the group extrovert, the leader. She didn't suggest Vegas, but she sure as hell put herself in charge the moment the others considered the trip. Standing in front of us in the hotel lobby, she held a list of places for us to check out. I stood by and let her list them off, everyone casting votes on which place to skip, which place to start with, and which ones to save for last. What we ended up with was a schedule starting with the most fun and the physically demanding stuff, gradually leading towards the more exciting, unsavory stuff. I had already mentally decided to call it when evening rolled around, to avoid the clubs. I guess I am the boring friend after all. I will say this about Vegas. A lot of places were surprisingly clean. Don't get me wrong, we saw plenty of streets that looked like the physical manifestation of a painful hangover, but many were straight out of Hollywood. It's colorful, it's loud, it's a theme park that people live in. It was almost surreal when you ended up on streets that looked plain or ordinary. Men in suits, kids leaving school, that kind of thing. I guess I knew very little about Las Vegas, of course. A lot of it is normal, but still, I found it interesting. When you turned onto a street where the buildings looked like modern art, I knew I'd be in for a hell of a time. Day drinking, slot machines, live shows, you name it. I can admire the work and effort they put into all of it, but it just wasn't for me. When we had dinner at what I thought was a nice casino restaurant, until I saw the male servers were in very tight, revealing outfits, I had just about mentally checked out. "Hey, I think I'm done," I said, before the chorus of ahs could get any louder. "I'm tired. The flight gave me a headache and everything." "Take a pill in my purse," one of them said. I think rest is better right now. You guys have fun, though. Try not to stay out too late. I felt older with every word and excuse. I'm 28, and I was talking like I was 48. That being said, the amount of free relief I felt walking into that empty hotel room was criminal, and I must have felt tired to some degree because the bed I fell onto had my eyes drooping. It was the cool, soft Egyptian cotton sheets that had me feeling that sleep was the finest pleasure on earth. I know that says a lot about me, but still, it was pretty good. I turned on the TV and flicked through the channels, finally ending up on a new episode of How It's Made. Well, maybe it was an old episode, I don't know. What I can say for sure is that my brain was locked in, and as the sun fell behind the horizon, I was gone. I woke up to a call. My phone was buzzing beside my head, the vibration doing more to wake me up than the light-hearted jingle I had set for a ringtone. I said the name, Sadie. "Yeah," I groaned. "What's up? It's 5 in the morning. Where are you guys?" "Hey, you're really missing out." Sadie's voice was garbled by music.
We're up the road, towards the red place. We're in the club with the big green monster truck out front. You can't miss it. Come on."
"You underestimate me," I muttered. I turned over in bed and looked out the window. The city was alive, even after a full night. Lights and sounds, the distant thump of music. There had to be some stellar muting in the walls because I could see that the party was not far away. I thought about going. It was the idea of missing out that bothered me a little, because I didn't think I was missing out. Yet when so many people you call friends say that you are, you start to wonder if you really know how to live at all. Maybe the happiness you feel from simple things isn't as potent as the happiness you get while being drunk in a club with your friends. "Screw that," I said. I knew that was a dumb way of thinking, but I also didn't feel that tired anymore. The least I could do was enjoy the trip my own way, and at that moment, I just wanted to go for a walk. Not in the streets, of course, but I did remember Sadie mentioning on her list of activities a walk thing just outside of town. I was the only one who was interested, and she didn't seem too enthusiastic when she had told us about it. I got out of bed and texted her, asking for the address, to which she sent me the Google business thing. No official page or anything, just a bare bones minimum. It lacked that Vegas flair everything had, and for me, that was a plus. Just after midday, I arrived at the place. I paid the taxi guy and jumped out into the heat. I always had decent clothes for outdoors with me. It was like my entire wardrobe. Yet the heat was still a surprise. I guess being in a cool car for half an hour would make it feel like stepping into an oven. The trail started a small collection of shacks, with one large building that looked like it was in good condition. It was painted an ugly yellow with small cartoonish paints all around it, like a cactus character, a tumbleweed, with some classic Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote thrown in for good measure. I don't think they were going for a cowboy theme, but that's what I felt when I saw the owner. A tall woman wearing chaps, a 10-gallon hat, and a checkered shirt. She looked like she had seen some things, just shocking the way the skin beneath her eyes seemed to bubble. Yet, when she saw me, she gave me the warmest smile. "You must be Cassandra, right?" she greeted, marching over with her hands outstretched. Yes, that's me," I said, holding mine out. She took and shook my arm like a wet noodle. "I'm not too late?" "Not at all. Some eccentric fellows are already set up for the first group today. There's still time to join them before they go." "Group?" "Yeah, I find it better to send people in groups. Less chance of people getting lost or bunching up on the trail. Better for pictures, you see." "Right. We also have a route for horses if you're interested in..." No horses. They scare me. I'll stick with the walking group." "Fair enough. I won't press you." I always hated when people said that. Nothing made me feel more pressured. Still, she was the sweetest lady, sweeter than honey and iced tea. I didn't say anything more and followed her to the start of the trail. There was clear signage with numbers near the fence and gate, indicating the different trails. The trail she pointed me to didn't have a sign or a number. "The first group should be waiting there." She pointed down the trail towards a huge rock. "They all set to leave in 5 minutes. Do you have anything you need?" "Water, hat, sunscreen," I said. "Good. It's hot now, but it'll get cool later. Little known fact about the desert," she said, pointing up a finger as if she expected me to take notes. I knew that already, of course. I nodded and started walking up the trail towards the rock. She already started her march back to the main building. I was feeling pretty good, excited even. I love the oppressiveness of the desert, and I was hoping that being 20 minutes out of Vegas, I would get to enjoy the natural beauty of it all. There was a group of people waiting by the rock, but looking at them was a little weird.
I mean, I don't want to show my ignorance, but I think they were religious or just had some kind of cultural thing going on. Maybe I was about to walk with some foreigners from overseas, or it was some kind of LARP group. I didn't know. There was at least 20 people there, and it was hard to tell if they were all men or not, because they were dressed in robes from head to toe. Not flowing robes either, but a lot more neat and constructed. My first real thought wasn't, what the hell are they wearing, but how the hell haven't they melted? All but one of their robes was red, but the last one, which was black. He stood tall and straight, the first one to turn in my direction. Upon seeing them, I was already psyching myself up to say something. Approaching the group of people alone was terrifying. As you can guess, Sadie and her group are the only ones who adopted me at work. I was just happy they did, because I would have never gone up to them otherwise. Room for one more? I said with a forced smile. I was quiet at first, but I supposed it was better to be a little too quiet than a little too loud. The ones in the red robes turned from me and looked at the one in black. Please do. Have you ever been on this trail before? The man said. No, first time. Be sure to stick close and conserve your energy. It is to be a long walk. The man in the black robe pointed towards the desert, the distant rocks and the sparse foliage. It felt so surreal, but also right, like I had stepped into the adventure I wanted. Only something kept throwing me off. It was the silence from such a large group. When we started on the path, I didn't hear anything from the people in the red robes. The only ones I had heard speak up until that moment was the man in the black robe. He would speak to me every few minutes, usually to point something out, but the gaps between those moments were growing longer. Initially, I thought he was a guide, but it became clear as he drifted into the others that he was just familiar with the trail. I was too shy to keep the conversation going, finding myself just enjoying the sights. The range of colors was just incredible. So many people think the desert is just muted, dry color, but there are just so many different shades of light and dark. The vibrant oranges when we found ourselves in the ravine were stunning. We followed a stream in that shallow ravine until the trail opened into the desert again, just in time to see the sun settle beyond the horizon. The sky becomes like blood, the man in the black robe said behind me. I jumped, not at his voice, but because I thought I was at the back of the group. I wanted to keep everyone in view. A beautiful red, yes? I turned to look at him. He was looking at me. I could see his eyes, his pale skin through the slit in the robe. It was odd to look at because his hands were dark. Another culture thing, maybe. When I had finally registered his words as a question, I stuttered in response. Oh, yeah, I said, feeling a chill run down my spine. I took the hoodie out of my backpack and pulled it on. Amazing how fast the cold comes in too, huh? Yes. Do you think you can make the walk back? He asked. We should almost be there, so... No, we are quite far now, he corrected. By night, the journey back should be quicker, but 5 hours seems about right. My heart sank. I thought we had taken some turns and were just about to see the start of the trail again over the hill. Yet, looking around, I should have been able to see that distant glow of Vegas. Instead, all I saw was dark, robed figures shambling ever onward into the desert. My water had run out, my phone had long since died, and I was hungry. My panic was stiff at first, but I began to hear it in my voice. Then, let's turn back, I said. You can go back. We're heading somewhere else, the man in black said. Is it close? Very, but you won't be able to join us, not as you are. He looked me up and down, and I wondered if he was referring to my clothes and
how I stood out amongst them, but something in his eyes showed a different kind of disgust. It was like my entire existence didn't fit in, not just my clothes. His tone was growing more serious, less friendly. He was losing patience. At that point, I noticed a building noise, a rumbling, which I mistook for chatter amongst the men and women in red robes. But as it grew louder, it sounded more like an uncoordinated hum, like they were all humming a song that none of them knew the lyrics to. Again, too late, he murmured, as it should be. So it is. Too late, I repeated. Mind where you step. Once your weight is on your foot, your choice is made. The humming had reached a breaking point in tone. The night sky became a lot darker. The stars, the moon, they vanished. The midnight blue became pitch black. A surreal void. It felt like something was blocking it out of sight, because that same darkness seemed to move wherever I looked. Yet the desert remained illuminated by some strange source of light. I could see the red robes against the pitch black, and I watched as they marched across the sand. I was overwhelmed by a sense of dread, a feeling of weakness. My whole body began to ache, and every effort seemed to strain my muscles and even my bones. I knew this feeling, the one bubbling inside me. It was many years ago when I was a child. I was coughing in bed constantly, day after day. That weakness kept me wondering how hollow I could get. I felt as weak and flimsy as a thin plastic bag. My heart, I could feel its every beat, as if all my insides were numb, and only it soldiered on. I was waiting for it to give out. The people in the red robes began to shed their blood-red fabric, naked forms that began to age and decay before my eyes. A space in the inky void ahead of me opened up, a shining white door, tall and thin. The way was clear, and I didn't have it in me to walk on. I was terrified. "Why are you scared?" the man in the black robe asked. "What awaits you is an end to the pain. Keep walking strong." He placed his hand on my shoulder and guided me. The people ahead of me were growing more grotesque by the second. I had no idea what made their bodies, so I was made to watch them unmake themselves. The skin, the fat, the pus, the blood, the shades of red began to turn blue and green. My head was burning inside. I felt dehydrated. While my body was in a state of shock and fear, my mind was trying its best to grip reality, to steer me away. The man in the black robe seemed to sense it, because he stopped walking and looked at me. With all my energy, I looked at him. "You cannot go back now. Your life is with them. It is only natural to pass over to the next plane." I felt the heat of my tears. It was just like those nights years ago. The very real fear of death. I'm ashamed of it now, but I wasn't thinking of my loved ones, not even my family. I didn't think of all the wrongs I'd done, the regrets I had. When I looked into that man's eyes, all I thought was, why now? The man seemed to sigh, but I didn't hear the exhale. His shoulders slumped and the humming faded completely. The shambling corpses turned around to look back at me with their empty eye sockets. "The dead must be laid to rest. It is only natural. The earth will bind the body and free the spirit." The man in black grabbed both my shoulders, twisting me around, and began to lay me on the ground as if I weighed nothing. I couldn't move. I could only watch as he began to scoop sand with his hands over me. I heard the rumbling again, but it sounded angry. I looked up as far as I could. It made my neck ache. I could see the world upside down, the white arch, and the silhouettes of the dead against the divine light. The corpses were moving closer, and they radiated malice. More tears and even a pathetic whimper. "Hush," the man in the black robe said. "They are not upon you yet." He was working fast, and only a few seconds later, I could feel sand over every inch of my body. He finished by pouring the sand over my face, covering me completely. I heard the dead close in. I heard a muttering of words, then I heard his scream. I try not to imagine the pain one must feel to make those sounds. He was still alive, but his cries grew further away as they carried him towards the white arch. I could gather that much from what I heard. As his voice faded, the rumbling ceased and strength returned to my body. I could breathe, and I was breathing in sand, was choking, gasping. I sat up, coughing and sputtering. I noticed immediately the pink and purple hue of the sky. On my back, I felt the warmth of the morning sun. Looking all around, I saw nothing. No dead people, no man in black, no inky sky, no white arch. All the evidence I had was the blood on the sand, and it's trailing off before stopping completely. I found a road and somebody to point me in the direction of Vegas, but they weren't willing to give me a lift back. Luckily, after an hour or two of walking, someone else did. I watched as we drove past the road leading to the yellow building where the trail began. I think I even saw Dorothy talking to a group of tourists. When I arrived at the hotel, I dug my room key out of my sandy backpack and held it to the front of the machine. It still worked, and a few seconds later I was taking a shower, trying to let the hot water bring a little more warmth to my body. After a while, I thought about the man in black. He wasn't a dead man, not like the others. He didn't seem evil, but he didn't seem sane either. No matter what the conclusion I made about him, I realized that he saved my life, and he paid the price for it. It was a thought that snapped everything into place, and I cried in the shower as all the feelings rushed at me once again. I spoke about this experience to only one person, a priest. I don't think he believed a word I said, not really. I think he thought I was talking about a dream or a nightmare. Yet he showed enough concern to say something wise and biblical about sacrifice. It wasn't his words that convinced me to redefine my faith. It was the thought of believing in nothing when something like that happened to me. It didn't sit right. That's what I gained for the price that someone else paid. I pray that it's enough. Gotta add another log to the fire. It's starting to get puny. But I think we got enough time for one more story. We've all read some of those strange travel articles, haven't we? It's nice sometimes to live vicariously through a writer while they traverse places and see strange landscapes, especially while we're stuck in an office somewhere just working for the weekend. But the subject of today's story may very well trade places with you if he could. So, come with me and let's go meet the Ghost Grass Hermit.
I'm an avid hiker. Always have been, but I may have to rethink the way I hike after this incident. I've done a lot of hiking in my time. Appalachian Trail, backpacking through Europe. I've hiked trails in Mexico on the border and watched the lights of coyotes as they come to drop off their cargo. And in that time, I've never really felt like I was in danger. I've had some close calls, don't get me wrong, but at no time did I ever wonder if I was going to live through these times or not. My last hike was the exception to that. I was hiking in the Midwest when I came across the most beautiful place I'd ever seen. I can't say exactly where I was. I was somewhere near the Kansas-Oklahoma border, though. What I was doing could easily have been classified as vagrancy, but I had the appropriate credentials, so any big-bellied Midwestern cop who stopped me knew I was out here shooting photos for Natural World, a magazine that had requested some travel shots. It was pretty cool to get paid for what was essentially professional homelessness, and when I stumbled upon the little dell and saw the grass fields, I knew I'd found my photo op. The grass sat at the bottom of the little dip, and I thought at first that I'd found a bog or a marsh. When the ground turned out to be solid, I made my careful way through it as I basked in the smell of wild hay and timothy. It was tall, the tips coming up over my head, and I let my hands slide delicately over the stalks as I walked through it. I was careful to keep my eyes peeled for snakes or any of the other biting or stinging insects that made a place like this their home. But I heard little beyond rustling as the residents took their leave of me. It was peaceful in the grass, and I lay down amidst it as I breathed in the heady aroma. I blinked a little longer than I meant to, I guess, because when I opened my eyes again, it was nearly pitch dark. I sat up, not sure what had happened. I'd never just fallen asleep like that before, and I was glad when I reached for my bag and found it was where I had left it. The flashlight showed me still within the womb of grass, and as I tried to orient myself, I found I had no clue which way I'd come in. The grass went from inviting by day to an aromatic trap by night, and the wind played games with my senses as it rustled the thick sheaves. I made my careful way through the thicket, the moon smiling at me from overhead in its grinning halfness. The stars were cold comfort as they winked down, and the longer I walked, the more certain I was that I was going in circles. The grass field hadn't been that large, an acre or two at the most, and as I walked in the unyielding straight line, I felt that I should have come out on the other side by now. Instead, I found a grass hut sitting in a small clearing. Calling it a hut may have not done it justice. It was a woven grass dome about 10 by 10 feet, the bands of grass expertly pushed through to create a curved dwelling that was likely to be dry. I could see smoke coming from the center, and I assumed there must be a little fire hole carved into it. The inside glowed slightly, like a furnace that's getting ready to go out, and the whole thing sat amidst a grass field that had been trampled flat. Whether by the feet of its inhabitants or not, I didn't know, but something about it looked a little spooky. It reminded me of the cannibal huts in the old Conan comics, and I hope the comparison wasn't apt. "Got yourself lost, son?" I jumped a foot and nearly dropped my flashlight, turning to see a hunched figure about 5 feet to my left. It was impossible to tell if it was a man or a woman, and its voice sounded ancient, but not threatening. It was hardly 4 feet tall in its hunched-up state, and it looked to be wearing a very old blanket in the fashion of a Mexican peasant in a Western novel. The sleeves hung over its arms like a wizard's robe, and the feet that poked from beneath looked to be covered in woven grass sandals. He grinned up at me with his unoccupied mouth, his gums wet and pulled into a smile, and I had to stop myself from shuddering as the silence stretched on into rudeness. "Sorry, you startled me, sir. Yeah, I must have stumbled into the grass here and lost my way. Any idea how I can get out?" "Just go that way and keep heading towards the sun at dawn," he said, hooking a thumb behind him. "Course, I guess it'll be a little hard till morning. Why don't you stay with me tonight? There's plenty of room in my little abode." I looked at the grass shack and then back at the little man. He'd startled me, but I decided there probably wasn't any harm in him. I agreed, and when he pressed on the side of the grass hut, I realized there was a door set expertly into the side of the hut. I had to marvel at the little creature's ingenuity as he showed me in, and the inside of the hut was no less impressive. The whole thing was set into the ground about 5 feet, and the roof extended down into the dirt walls. The smoke hole was the only opening to the sky, and the fire within burned cheerily. There was a pot sitting in the fire, and the contents made my mouth water a little bit. It smelled like meat and grain, and I imagined it was likely rabbit or squirrel, given the man's location.
As I sat by the fire, I couldn't help but wonder how long it had taken him to craft something like this. The effort at work here would have taken weeks, if not months, and the end result was something truly spectacular. I made a mental note to get some pictures during the daytime, knowing the magazine would love to see it. "So, what brings you this far into the grass field?" he asked, taking the lid off the pot and stirring at it with a spoon. "I was just hiking," I said, the warm interior making me feel sleepy all over again. "I take pictures for magazines and write travel articles, and I sort of stumbled across your field on my way between places." The man ladled some of the pot's contents into a bowl, and as he handed it to me, I was amazed to see that it was also made of woven grass. He lifted a gourd jug to his lips and sipped before picking up his own bowl, and when he offered it to me, I found it was full of spring water. The bowl was full of stew. The meat went well with the roots and things he had mixed with it. It was a little bland, but filling, and he seemed to chew over what I had said as much as the meal. "Taking pictures, eh?" he finally said, the words a little muffled as he chewed at the gristle. "Are you some sort of reporter?" "Not really. More like a journalist, I guess. I write articles for Natural World. It's a magazine for outdoorsmen and hikers and the like." The fella, I suppose that I had been thinking of him as a little old man in my head, nodded as he sipped at the broth of his soup. He was quiet for a little bit, the fire crackling between us the only sound in the hut, before he asked his next question. "What sort of stories do you write for your magazine?" I had been crunching at some of the vegetables that hadn't been cooked all the way, and swallowed them a little too hastily as he sent his next pondering at me. I coughed, reaching for the gourd as the water slopped down my face, and managed to worry them down. The old man's ponderous way of talking and long bouts of silence were a little strange, but I found him to be an agreeable dinner host. Usually local pieces, lore or tourist spots that the readers might be interested in. Beauty spots they might want to take in, interesting points of order in the area, local legends and things. Anything really to get people buying magazines. "What about urban legends?" he asked, his smile returning as he lowered his bowl. The glint of firelight off his gums made the effect all the more grisly. I coughed again, but it had nothing to do with the remains of wild carrot and roots. Something, if they're especially interesting. Readers always like a bit of local color, I admitted, like it might be a dirty secret. "Well, it just so happens that the grass field you're sitting in is a little piece of local history. I could tell you about it, if you like." My excitement was at odds with my unease at this point. This was one of those situations that prickles that ancient part of your brain, the one that stopped your forebears from getting eaten by predators. That being said, the story was already starting to come together in my mind. Sitting in an honest-to-God hut and hearing a story by firelight, by a native no less, was the kind of things these stories were made of. To be living one was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and not one that I was going to pass up. My editor was going to absolutely have a fit when I sent him this, and I could already smell the bonus check. "I'd love to. You don't mind if I use the story, do you?" "I'd be delighted," the old man said, and when he leaned forward, his wrinkled old face looked like a jack-o'-lantern in the dancing firelight. The hut took on a shadowy cast as his head blocked out some of the light, and the effect was impressive. "This field was once called Fairy's Rest. It was said that on summer nights you could see the fireflies dancing through the stalks, and the travelers who witnessed it thought they must be fairies holding a revel. An old hermit lived out in this very field, in this very hut, in fact, and he acted as a sort of medicine man. He brewed cures for the most part, helping people who needed tonics and tinctures, and was well loved by the community. Some said he was a warlock, a trickster who was in league with Satan, but the locals knew him to be a fine enough sort and
generally left him to his own pursuits. I found myself leaning in a little as he spoke, the smoke stinging my eyes some as it wafted up from the crackling depths of the fire. The little town of Maverick got a new preacher man one spring, and that was when the trouble started. The new preacher was one of those fire and brimstone sorts, suffer not a witch to live disciples, who had set his sights on the old hermit for some reason. He chastised the people of Maverick, asking how they could claim to be godly while allowing an agent of Satan to live in their midst. He told them that God would surely punish them for their inaction if they continued to let him live so close to their town. But the people were not so quick to act. They didn't mind having the old man so close to town. Many of them benefited from it, but the preacher was persuasive. It took him some time, but he finally convinced them that the old man's very existence would spoil their relationship with God, and they made plans to go and oust him. As I listened, I found myself watching the shadows on the wall of the hut. In the dancing light of the fire, I could almost see the mob with their torches and pitchforks as they made their way to the grasslands to smoke out the poor old fellow. At their head was a man in a tall hat with a torch held aloft as he led them to their work. I wondered if maybe water was all that was in that gourd, but the old man's story had me hooked. Well, they came to the grassy patch, but no matter how much they searched or how deep they went, they couldn't find the hermit's house. It should have been impossible, but the longer they looked, the more furious the preacher became. He told them this was proof of the old man's misdeeds, and that Satan himself must surely be hiding the old warlock. Finally, he took a torch and set the grass ablaze, sending smoke into the sky as it burned. They burned the patch flat, down to the soil, and when it was done, they rode back to town triumphant. As he told the story, the smell of the fire was replaced with the acrid smell of a wildfire. I could just imagine someone trapped in that hellish blaze, their house burning around them as they sat inside, knowing there was no escape. Had the hermit tried to run through the burning grass? Had the smoke gotten him before the flames did? I coughed, reaching for the gourd again, and the old man seemed to revel in my discomfort. Well, imagine their surprise when the spot was reported to have returned a week later. They never found the old man, but it was said that smoke could be seen coming from the grass field. It was said that people had started going missing, too. Anyone who was involved in the burning either went missing themselves or saw a member of their family disappear. Most of the time, it was children, but sometimes a spouse or a cousin would suffice. Eventually, the people of Maverick told the preacher he wasn't welcome anymore and forced him out of town in the hopes the old man's spirit would be appeased. He sat back from the fire then, watching me as I leaned in closer, the fire hot against my face as I fell deeper into the tale. After that, they called this place Ghost Grass, and those who venture in sometimes never come out again. Travelers, hikers, local kids who don't heed their parents' warnings, they all fall victim to the ghost grass and the vengeful old soul who resides there. He doesn't take them all, though. He still leaves a few, the ones he let live so they might spread the story. Those who come here without invitation, however, learn better than to meddle with things outside their kin. The people of Maverick still remember, and they always will. I leaned back as he finished,
letting the implications sink in. Was he claiming to be the vengeful spirit of the grassy field? Or was he just messing with me? Suddenly, I had never felt less tired in my life, but when he suggested that we turn in for the night, I agreed without argument. Where would I go, after all? The people who had come to find the old hermit had never discovered the place. What were the odds of me stumbling out again with only the moon to guide me? I lay in the shadows of the hut, the fire burning low as the old man lay on the opposite side. He never snuffled or tossed, just lay there like a stone as I shivered beneath my blanket. I didn't want to sleep, didn't want to drop off with this thing so close to me. But I felt my long day of hiking catching up with me. I fought against sleep, trying not to fall into the web, but eventually the matter was settled for me, and I came awake in the morning like a diver breaking the surface. The hut was dark, but I could see the sun through the smoke hole. The old man was nowhere to be found, and I saw little else to do but pack up my bedding and leave. I got some pictures, kind of wishing the old man was there so I could include him, and left the hut behind me. I found my way out of the grass just as he had suggested, and after a single look back, I set off west, just as I had for the last week. The woods were far behind me, and the flatlands I found myself in were dotted with farms and fences, crops and cattle, and a dark snake that stretched its way across the ground as far as the eye could see. The road appeared once I broke the hills, and I followed it for most of the day. I saw a sign around noon that told me Maverick was 2 miles up the road, and when the outskirts came into view, I was glad to be back in civilization. I stopped at a local diner to write this down and send it to my editor, wanting to get it all out while it was still fresh. I don't know why I was worried about missing a detail, because I don't think any of the night before will ever leave my mind. The people of Maverick are very familiar with the grasslands and the legends that surround them. The woman at the Desert Flower Diner where I sit now shuddered when I told her about the night I'd had. She said I was lucky to be alive, luckier than Bill Register and his friends at least. When I asked who they were, she pointed to a bulletin board by the door. There hung 3 missing persons posters, bearing the faces of 3 high school kids who had recently gone missing. Thinking about what meat might have been in that pot I ate makes my stomach flip, but suppose it's too late to regret now. So if you find yourself traveling the footpaths of Oklahoma, and you come across a field of tall, lush grass, be very careful. They might hang your missing poster on that board too, should you become the next victim of the ghost grass hermit. I think that'll just about do it for today. But I hope you'll be back tomorrow for more stories and great times spent with friends. Until then, Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful day and a spooky evening.